Tell us a little bit about your history and background.
Well, I suppose really I'm a child of the empire in the sense that I was born in India and therefore I had an early life which is very different to most people's now. My father went out to India as a young man, was what was called a boxwallah. He worked in business and general trading. And by the time of the war, he was essentially had risen to the top, if you like, of Indian business, was president of the Chamber of Commerce, and very interestingly, was totally involved, if you like, in partition. He spoke Hindi and Urdu, and as a result, he was very involved during the partition years. He was involved in all the meetings with Mountbatten and everything else. So he had an absolutely fascinating life, as many people did. He retired when he reached the age of 55, and that was in about 1957. I was 8 or 9 years old at that stage, but had all my early years in India. I did all the usual things. I used to be put on a plane back to school, given to a BOAC stewardess, and waved goodbye at Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta, met by my aunt 8,000 miles away and off to school. So my first few years, if you like, were very much one of a child of the empire. My father retired, and we came back here, and he then worked in a company linked very much to India. So I had a typical empire background, prep school, public school, and then eventually he retired completely. We have a place in Scotland, and he always wanted to go there. At that stage, aged about 18, I got sent to America to broaden my horizons, which was great fun. I became a cowboy, literally for a year, and literally a cowboy. And when I came back, I then joined the army. And I joined a regiment called the Royal Scots Greys. And they were, in fact, my grandfather had been in the Scots Greys and also various relatives. So we're sort of a military family. Anyway, a few years of that, and I then decided that I was going to farm and to come back to the family farm. So I went off to agricultural college and did all that, and then started farming. And really, farming just didn't make any money. I couldn't make a living out of farming, and my mother needed the income. So I packed my red spotted handkerchief, like Dick Whittington, and headed off to London, at least metaphorically, living up here. And then I went into the city and got involved in various businesses down there, commuting from an office in Glasgow. And I got involved in venture capital, lots of startups, and also the film business. In fact, I think I must be the only farmer in Lanarkshire who actually won an Oscar for a film. So that's
Wow.
something unusual. So from there, I really then went on, I was farming and kept on farming and commuting to London and working. And then I retired there. And then I thought, right, well, I'll do something which I wasn't able to do because I was away so much. And I decided that I would go into local politics. So that's really where I am now, and enjoying it quite a lot. I'm in a pretty much of a minority group, otherwise known as conservatives, but I do enjoy it, and I get quite a lot of pleasure out of doing all the things I wasn't able to do while I was working. Anyway, there we go. Potted history.
Right. We're definitely going to come back a little bit to your life as a politician. And I think we have to come back in a minute to your Oscar, which I didn't know anything about. But let's start in India. And how long were you there before they packed you off to a boarding school?
Till I was eight, essentially. And what they did, literally, I remember my first trip back, I actually was on a flying boat, a Sunderland flying boat. I'm not even sure it wasn't called Imperial Airways, not even BOAC then. So it took 3 days to get back, and we went all the way by sea, landing in all the various places all around Bombay, Sharjah, Aden, Cairo, then to Brindisi, where we hopped on a land plane and off to Heathrow. It took 3 days.
How aware before you went to boarding school, which I'm assuming you came back in the holidays, but before then you were kind of immersed in the environment of India. How much were you aware of what was going on at that young early age?
Absolutely not at all. You wouldn't have known. I mean, the life they led, it was the tail end of the empire. People went out to India because they had a wonderful life, didn't cost very much. You had servants, you had nannies, ayahs, as they called them. And I went to the British school there, a wonderful school called Miss Bath's School, which is the equivalent of I suppose, primary. And you just lived a fairly normal life. I rode every day of my life with my father. I used to go out, and so I effectively was sort of a privileged child without any doubt, but I was absolutely unaware of anything that was going on. I heard stories and lots of stories of people and things that mainly my father had been involved in. He had a very interesting life, but as to me, no.
Would you have mixed with the local population, or would you have been basically kept separate from them?
Not remotely. My father was famous in India. He formed a club. He got fed up with the rather whites-only type society, and he left the club in Calcutta. It was called the Saturday Club, and started his own club called the 300. And he deliberately set out to mix local Indian businessmen, the Maharajas, the army, everyone, a very eclectic group of people. And the club was famous because of the fact that it was the first attempt in certainly Calcutta, if not India, to genuinely make an attempt to actually mix the populations, the whites and the locals. And it was incredibly successful. It was open 24 hours a day, to give you some idea of the type of place it was.
Uh-huh. This is a kind of very broad question, but and possibly a slightly uh, difficult question to ask, or a naive question maybe. But what are the differences, the main differences between the culture at that time of the dare I say English? I don't want to use the word occupiers, but the English. What's the word we're looking for here?
In indigenous? No, maybe not.
Indigenous between the English and the indigenous
Well,
spoke
yeah.
there.
I think it's a difficult one. I mean, I never was conscious of any difference because our house was always filled with a lot of Indian people. Remember, my father was in business. He was president of the Chamber of Commerce. He was head of his own company then called Gladstone Lyle, and it was one of the big general trading companies. And he walked with Maharajas, he walked with Rajas, he walked with businessmen. He was very much one of the people who quite early on took a view that India was obviously going to get its independence, and it was actually going to be very important for the future for all races to mix. So, I mean, I had Indian friends. I don't remember where or who they were, but I mean, I had, people came to play with you, if you like. That's the way it was all organized. I had an Indian nanny. I was surrounded, obviously, but mainly by Indian servants, and it was a different world. It's very interesting. I mean, when my father died, he left India in 57. He died in 77. And when I was cleaning up his affairs, I discovered he was still paying pensions to the remaining surviving servants who had worked for him in India 20 years before. So that sort of patrician approach was very interesting. A lot of people don't even begin to understand that. So
It,
uh, I personally don't know. And I mean, I still got quite a few Indian friends who are the children of the friends of my father. So I don't see any difference.
right, let's move forward in time to something I didn't know about you, which is your Oscar. You better tell us a bit more about that before we come on to your current life.
Well, as I said, I went down to London and I got involved in the world of venture capital, which is, if you like, it's the sharp end of the capitalist world. It's startups, it's new businesses, it's really raising money from people who've made a lot of money. They were given tax breaks, and the tax breaks were sufficiently attractive so that if they lost the money they invested, it was actually in the end no worse than paying tax. So they were attracted because if they made money, and very occasionally you did, then of course they did very well and the gains were free of tax. So I started off in venture capital raising money for all sorts of odd subjects and very peculiar things, making um, growing acres of earthworms in order to get rid of refuse or whatever. There were lots of silly things. And then suddenly someone came along and said, look, we're making a film. Would you help raise the money for it? The tax breaks were attractive. And so I sort of got lured into the world of filmmaking. It's a pretty cutthroat world, and very few make money. Most of the time, you lose money, but some of the films are quite interesting. We were involved in quite a lot of films which vaguely known. I can't remember some of the names now. Brassdorf, Last King of Scotland. Some films which did okay, and we also suddenly got asked to make this extraordinary little film about Peter and the Wolf. They'd made a few before, and the music is Prokofiev's music. And it was made rather like Wallace and Gromit, a stop frame animation film where you literally take millions of photographs and join them all together. Silent film played, designed to be played with a background of live orchestras and a big film being shown in the background, beautifully made. And anyway, you make films and you never really know what's going to happen. Then quite suddenly, it's got put forward for a thing called the Palme d'Or, which is one of the European things, and then it got a BAFTA, and then suddenly, before we knew what was happening, it finished up going to the Oscars in Hollywood, and I was invited along. I thought it had no chance at all, so I went off to play golf in Mallorca and decided it wasn't worth going. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the same year that Ratatouille, which you might remember, won the best long animated film, Peter and the Wolf won the best short animated film Oscar. So, much to my surprise and amazement, here I am, really, basically a farmer or a businessman, with an Oscar sitting on my mantelpiece.
How fascinating. Right. Just because we're kind of constricted with time, let's fast forward again and talk a little bit about your life in politics. We had an interesting conversation yesterday where you basically told me that, on a local level, all the different parties basically just get on with it, as opposed to getting into big political discussions. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, I mean, I've always been interested in politics, but because I mainly worked in London, I was away all week. I never got involved locally. And then when I did stop work, basically, I have to declare my political colours was the SNP are in power, and they so infuriated me that one day I was basically throwing my dog's soft toys at the television when Nicola Sturgeon was on the screen. And she stood up and said, right, she said, are you going to sit here for the rest of your life making a fuss and shouting and complaining? If you feel that strongly, go and do something. So I did. So I marched off and said, look, can I be a local councillor? And they said, why do you want to be? And I said, I can't stand the SNP. So they said, fine, pass. You've done the interview. And off I went and became a local councillor. Much to my surprise, it's a rural area. I actually finished up when I stood with more votes than either Labour or SNP in my area. But the votes have divided pretty equally between the three. So I joined, and just in order to become involved in what I call in local politics, although really, if you're a minority party, the majority of our decision making and the direction is affected by the party in power. In our case, it's SNP or Labour. So what we're reduced to doing mainly is looking after your local population, helping them with their various problems, and they can vary from health, from education, you know, potholes, it could be their roads, it could be housing, it could be education. There are an awful lot of areas where people have a lot of domestic problems, where they quite often try to get hold of the council, try to get something done, and it takes them a long time. And then in desperation, they ring me or one of the other councillors, and we can usually actually get something done. And there's no competition locally between us in terms of who does what. We have a system whereby basically the first person who gets there solves the problem. We get on very well with each other locally, and we just take care not to mention politics, because the moment you scratch that little wound, it always bleeds. And it's much better just to leave it alone and get on with what I'd call the local day-to-day business.
How does the relationship with the local council, meaning the administration of the council, the people who do the day-to-day services, how does that work? Presumably you have to liaise with some of the senior officers on the council. Do you find that the relationship is friendly? Is it acrimonious? How does that go? Is it difficult to work with, being basically civil servants, or are they fairly amenable to take direction from you as councillors?
It's a very good question, that, but in the reality is it's there are two sides to the whole setup, essentially, just like Westminster. They are what you might call the itinerant journeymen, which should otherwise be known as the politicians, the MPs or the councillors, and they change and they move and they get elected or they disappear. And then the other side of the fence, you've got the administration, if you like, the officers of the council, and they're very good. They do work hard. They don't show, seemingly to me, any no fear or favor, if you like. If you ask them to do something, they do it. What they do have a habit of doing is what I call, if you put them on the spot about something which you don't agree with, some money that you think they've been wasting or spending needlessly or whatever, they then circle the wagons amongst themselves and tend to try and fend you off, if you like. But that's not political. That's more or less, you're just someone who's complaining about something. What do you know, if you like? But I've never had a problem. They've always been very friendly, as far as I'm concerned, and very helpful.
Right. And just to wrap up with, you live in Scotland's highest village, or one of two villages that claim that title. Tell us a little bit about life up there, because I used to live not too far away from you, and it certainly has its own sort of microculture up there.
Well, it's a rural area. That's the first thing. Lanark itself is a very, very old market town, and we're sort of above Lanark, up slightly up in the hills. And the land isn't brilliant. 800 feet, fairly short growing season, so you're quite limited. It was an old dairy area. Now it's more beef, cattle, and sheep. And some areas where the ground is good enough, you get crops, but the yields on the crops are not that good. So farming is not, it doesn't pay hugely well. Most of the dairies have gone. There are now a few large farms. And our farm here, where I live on a farm, is basically a bit of all beef, sheep, and barley. And frankly, it's not really profitable. It's sort of a form of gardening on a large scale without much profit. There are not many businesses around here because then, you're a long way from, if you like, the bigger centres, whether it be Glasgow or Edinburgh. There are a few businesses, quite a few related to agriculture. But generally speaking, Lanark was an old market town. It was famous for the Lanark auction market, one of the oldest in the country, and that's still going. And so it's very much still a centre for farming. But what we do is driven really by our height and by the weather. We've got 50 or 60 inches of rain a year. That's quite a lot. There's quite a lot of market gardening, but most of that tends to happen further down the Clyde Valley. and the old tomato houses and all the fruit growing that used to happen here has pretty much disappeared in favour of market gardening. So it's not it's like any upper piece of upper ground or higher ground. It's hard work, I think, and the town struggles like all small towns now. High streets are dying. It's not a great sort of future, I think, at the moment because of the internet and so on and so forth for those sort of people.
I have heard there's gold in them there hills.
Sorry?
I have heard there's gold in them there hills.
Yeah, well, it might be. Maybe it is. It isn't anywhere under my ground. Although we do have prospectors because we're an old house and the garden is an old place and there are lots of bits and pieces. We have got all these metal prospectors who come around and they do occasionally find bits and pieces, coins and occasional gold ring and even some old musket balls the other day. So there's plenty of history under our ground. I mean, we're a very old area. The Romans arrived here and they built a camp about 2 miles from us, a very famous, very large camp. And there's a Roman road which runs straight under our ground, which I have seen exposed once or twice when people have been building houses. Unbelievable construction. But funnily enough, it's been occupied, this part of the world, for a very long period.